It is no light thing to awaken in Baker Street to a silence that is not silence at all, but rather a hush strained tight as the skin of a drum. The city may be muffled by fog and soot, its wheels softened by damp, yet there are mornings when London seems to hold its breath, as though it anticipates some mischief about to break the surface of respectable life. Such a morning it was when my attention was drawn, before I had quite finished the simple domestic business of buttoning a cuff, to the cessation of those small sounds by which our household declares itself alive. Mrs. Hudson's tread in the passage, the faint clink of china from below, even the steady scratching of Holmes' pen upon paper, all had ceased. In their place there was only the faintest hiss from the fire, and the ticking of the clock upon the mantel, each second sounding to my ear like a measured step. Holmes, who had been stretched full length upon the sofa when I last looked, arms folded, eyes half closed, in that peculiar attitude of wakeful slumber which signified, more often than not, an overtaxed mind, was now upright and motionless, his long fingers steepled before his lips. His gaze was fixed, not upon me, nor upon the window, but upon the space between, as though he watched some invisible drama play itself out upon the very air. "You have ceased to pretend you are reading," said he suddenly, without turning his head. I had indeed been holding the Times at a most respectable angle for some minutes, more from habit than from any desire to absorb its particulars. Holmes's remark, however, was delivered with such calm certainty that it startled me into an involuntary glance at the page, as if I might yet retrieve the deception. "You are unjust," I returned. "I had not the least intention of pretending anything." "On the contrary, you intended it excellently," said he. "But your left thumb has shifted twice in the same place, as it always does when you are not following the column. Also, the paper is upside down." I lowered it with what dignity I could muster. "Then you have been watching me?" "Not you," said he, with that airy detachment which could be infuriating in a lesser man. "I have been listening." "To what?" "To London," Holmes answered, rising and moving to the window with the noiseless step of a cat. He drew back the curtain a few inches. The morning was the colour of tarnished silver. The street below lay half swallowed by a rolling yellow-grey fog. A hansom passed like a ghost ship across a sea. The outlines of the opposite houses were dim, and the gas lamps burned with a sickly flame. "There is a quality to certain days," Holmes went on, "which makes the ordinary extraordinary. It is not that events change, Watson, but that one's perception is sharpened. The nerves become strings that sing at the slightest touch." "You speak as if you expect a case," I observed. Holmes smiled, but it was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has already heard the distant thunder. "I do not expect one," said he. "I have one." He turned from the window, and as he did so, I caught sight of a small object in his hand, a scrap of cream-coloured paper folded twice, as if torn in haste and then reconsidered. He held it out to me, and I took it. It was, I saw at once, a piece of heavy stationery, faintly scented with some violet perfume. The handwriting was neat, of the type one sees in women who have been trained to keep their emotions within the bounds of penmanship. And yet there was something in the pressure of the ink, in the sharpness of the downstrokes, that suggested distress, controlled only by force of will. The note ran thus: "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I am in great fear, but I do not know whether my fear is justified. There is a house, do not smile, sir, there is a house which refuses new owners. 3 times it has been sold, 3 times it has emptied itself of those who would possess it, as a dog shakes off fleas. If you are the man they say you are, then you will understand that I do not write of ghosts, I write of men. Come to me at once if you can, and bring Dr. or Watson, whose name I have heard spoken with respect. Eleanor Carroway, Carroway House, Brackenbury Square, W.P.S. If you come, do not approach the front door. Use the side passage by the iron gate. I shall leave it unlatched." I read it twice, and a third time more slowly, for the phrase "a house which refuses new owners" had a singular power to grip the imagination. I confess that the storyteller in me stirred at it, though the practical soldier and physician remained skeptical. "A melodramatic lady," said I at last, returning the note. "If she disclaims ghosts, she at least invites them." Holmes had resumed his seat and was filling his pipe, his eyes upon me with a mild amusement. "And yet?" he asked. "And yet," I admitted, "she writes with a restraint that makes me think she truly fears something. The caution about the door—" "Excellent," said Holmes, striking a match. "Now we begin to speak of realities, though. You have other information?" Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke, and with it seemed to exhale also his impatience with ordinary minds. "I have, let us say, corroboration," he replied. "The name Brackenbury Square has appeared twice within the week in my correspondence. Once in a letter from a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, and once in a note from Lestrade, who has by some miracle learned to spell it." He leaned forward and tapped ash into the grate. "Do you recall, Watson, that curious little problem of the blue carbuncle?" "Certainly." "And the less curious little problem," said Holmes, "of the man who insisted his wife had been stolen by a cab?" "I remember." "Both were in essence problems of ownership," Holmes continued. "Who possessed what and by what right? Men will do extraordinary things when property is in question. The law supposes that possession is a simple matter, an entry in a ledger, a signature on parchment. Life, however, often declines to be so orderly." "You believe this to be some fraud?" I suggested. "I believe," said Holmes, "that the lady writes truthfully when she says the house is not haunted, and I believe she lies, perhaps even to herself, when she implies the house is the actor." I confess that I had never known Holmes to speak so much in parable, unless his mind was already racing far ahead upon the track, and he chose to let my slower faculties trot behind at their own pace. "You will go?" I asked. Holmes's reply was to rise, take his coat from the peg, and place his violin case beneath his arm with that habitual movement which told me he expected either a long wait or a sudden burst of action, two circumstances equally suited to the melancholy consolation of music. "We shall go at once," said he, "and I advise you, Watson, to bring your revolver." This last remark, delivered as casually as if he had said, "Bring your umbrella," put a new complexion upon the affair. I had learned in our adventures never to undervalue Holmes's instincts, though he would have corrected me sharply for the word, never to undervalue, I should say, Holmes's perceptions. Within a quarter of an hour we were rattling in a hansom through the fog, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the wet stones. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin sunk upon his chest, his eyes half-lidded. To the casual observer he would have appeared to doze, but I could see the minute twitch of his fingers and the set of his mouth that told me his mind was alive with calculation. "Who is Eleanor Carroway?" I asked, to break the silence. Holmes's eyes opened a fraction. "A woman who has been careful not to become a subject for gossip," said he, "and therefore naturally has become one." "That is not an answer," Holmes smiled. "It is the beginning of one. The Carroway house upon Brackenbury Square is not, as one might suppose, her family seat. It is a rented residence, modest for the name, which belongs to the estate of Sir Hugh Densmore." "Densmore," I began, and then checked myself, for the name had the ring of old money and public offices. "Quite," said Holmes. "The late baronet, a man whose virtues were praised most loudly by those who had benefited from them, and whose vices were concealed with equal diligence. He died last year, leaving behind a nephew, one Mr. Lionel Densmore, who is understood to have inherited the title and the burden of debt in equal measure." "You have been reading society columns," I said with some surprise. Holmes's lip curled. "I have been reading solicitors' notices. Society columns merely dress the corpse for viewing. And Eleanor Carroway is a lady connected in some manner with the Densmore estate. Whether as tenant, relative, or inconvenience remains to be seen." The hansom turned into a broader thoroughfare where the fog thinned somewhat. Brackenbury Square emerged like an island, Neat railings, bare winter trees, tall brick houses with white-painted steps. Even here, in the comparative respectability of the West, the atmosphere of the morning clung, a damp chill that seemed to creep into the bones. Holmes leaned forward and rapped upon the roof. "Stop here," he called. The driver pulled up at the corner and Holmes sprang out, beckoning me to follow. Instead of proceeding directly to the house indicated, he turned into a narrow side lane flanking the square. "The side passage?" I remarked. "Just so," said Holmes. "When a client warns you off the front door, it is generally because someone is watching the front door." The lane was bordered by high brick walls, their tops crowned with broken glass. An iron gate stood half concealed by ivy, its latch indeed unfastened. Holmes pushed it gently and it swung inward without a sound. We found ourselves in a small enclosed yard behind one of the square's houses. The windows here were tall and curtained. A thin line of smoke rose from a chimney, but otherwise the place had that lifeless look which even inhabited houses sometimes wear as, if they endured their occupants rather than welcomed them. Holmes did not at once approach the door. Instead, he stood for a moment in the yard, his gaze sweeping over the ground, the brickwork, the drain pipe, the sill of the lowest window. Then, with the same curious care that a naturalist might give to a rare insect, he bent and examined the earth near the threshold. "You see," he murmured, "I saw only damp gravel and a strip of muddy soil." "I see nothing," I confessed. Holmes straightened and with the tip of his walking stick indicated a shallow mark in the mud.
"A heel print," said he. "Not the tread of Mrs. Hudson, I assure you." "You mean someone has been here recently?" "Someone," said Holmes, "who has good boots and bad intentions. Observe the depth. He lingered. Observe the angle. He faced the door, not the yard. He waited." "For whom?"
Holmes's eyes lifted to the window above. The curtain there, heavy and dark, had a faint irregularity to it, like a crease hastily smoothed. "For our client," said Holmes softly. "Or for us." He stepped to the door and knocked, not loudly but in a precise rhythm. 3, pause, 2. It was, I recognized, his signal when discretion was advisable. At first there was no response. Then came the faint sound of a chain, a sliding bolt, and the door opened the merest crack, held fast by a security latch. A woman's face appeared, pale against the darkness within. She was perhaps 30, with hair of a deep chestnut drawn back severely, and eyes that were striking not for their colour, but for their steadiness. Yet even in those steady eyes I detected a shadow of fatigue, the sort that comes not from lack of sleep alone, but from lack of safety. "You are Mr. Holmes," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Holmes replied, with the brief inclination of his head that served him in place of courtesy. "And this is Dr. Watson." At the mention of my name she seemed to relax a fraction, as if some portion of her courage had been borrowed from my supposed respectability. "Come in," she whispered, and unfastened the latch. We entered a narrow passage with a patterned carpet worn thin at the centre. The air held the faint scent of lavender over something mustier beneath, as though perfume had been employed not for pleasure but for concealment. The house was not grand, but it had the dignity of good materials, polished wood, heavy doors, a staircase that curved with quiet elegance. Eleanor Carroway led us into a sitting room at the back, drew the curtains tight, and only then turned to face us fully. In the lamplight her pallor was more evident, and I saw that her hands, though she held them clasped, trembled slightly. "I am grateful you came so quickly," she said. Holmes had not sat. He stood by the fireplace, his body angled so that he could see both the door and the windows, a habit I had observed in him when he judged danger possible. "You implied urgency," said he. "Tell me what you mean by a house refusing new owners." Her lips tightened at the phrase, as if she regretted it. "It sounds foolish now," she admitted, "but I did not know how else to put it in so few words." "Then take more words," said Holmes. "Truth has no reason to be economical. She looked down at the carpet for a moment, as if arranging her thoughts upon its faded pattern. "This house," she began, "belongs to the Densmore estate, as you may have learned. It was occupied for many years by Sir Hugh's younger brother, Mr. Alistair Densmore. He died 3 years ago. After his death it was sold." Holmes's eyelids lowered slightly, which I knew to be a sign not of boredom but of concentration. "It was bought by a gentleman named Mr. Partridge," she continued. "A man in trade, newly wealthy, eager to establish himself. He moved in with his wife and 2 daughters. Within a fortnight they left. They would not speak of it. They lost money in the sale, but they would not stay another day." "And the second owner?" asked Holmes. "A widow, Mrs. Evesham. She lasted 3 nights. On the 4th morning she was found in the square, half-dressed, her hair down, screaming that the walls were whispering. She was taken away. The doctors called it hysteria." Holmes's eyes flicked to me for an instant, as if to note my profession's culpability in so convenient a diagnosis. "The third," Eleanor said, her voice tightening, "was a clergyman, Reverend Marr. He believed it his duty to show courage. He held prayers in every room. He sprinkled holy water, he read scripture, and then—" She stopped, and for the first time her composure cracked. A flush rose in her cheeks, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if to keep some sound from escaping. Holmes spoke more gently. "Then what?" "Then he vanished," she whispered. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the fog outside. "Vanished?" I repeated. "How do you mean, kidnapped?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "There was no struggle. His servant said he went up to his study after supper to prepare his Sunday sermon. In the morning he was gone. The room was locked from the inside. The window was latched. There was no sign of him. No note, no mark, nothing." Holmes's eyes were very bright now. "And the police?" "Lestrade came," she said. "He said it was impossible. He suggested—" She hesitated, and her mouth twisted in distaste. "He suggested the Reverend had staged it for money, or fled with a woman, or had been seized by some religious mania and wandered away." "And you?" Holmes's voice was level. "I was not here then," she replied. "I came afterward." Holmes at last took a chair, though he sat perched upon its edge like a man ready to spring. "You came afterward," he repeated. "Explain your interest." Eleanor drew a breath, as if crossing a threshold in her own mind. "I am Sir Hugh's secretary," she said. "I was his secretary for 7 years. When he died, Mr. Lionel Densmore, his nephew, retained me for the estate business. It is complicated." And she spoke the word with a faint bitterness. "Money," said Holmes. She gave a small, humourless smile. "And pride. Mr. Lionel wishes to sell what he can, to settle debts. This house, with its history, has become difficult to sell. He insists the stories are nonsense and that any hesitation is cowardice. But every time a buyer is found, something occurs and they withdraw. Now the estate is pressing," Holmes supplied. "Yes." Eleanor's hands clenched tighter. "So Mr. Lionel has required me to reside here, to show that the house is perfectly safe. He believes that if I can live here a month without incident, the rumours will be silenced." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the line of his jaw harden. "And you agreed?" "I had little choice," she said simply. "My employment is my livelihood." "And there are other obligations." "Very well," said Holmes. "How long have you been here?" 6 days. "And in 6 days," Holmes continued, "you have chosen to write to me by stealth, instructing me to avoid the front door and telling me you are in fear. Something has happened." Eleanor's eyes lifted, and for the first time I saw something in them beyond fear. Anger. "Yes," she said. "Something has happened, not a ghost story. Not whispers in the walls, not a clergyman vanished like smoke. Something human, something deliberate." She crossed to a small escritoire and unlocked a drawer. From it she drew a folded paper, and with it a small object wrapped in cloth. This, she said, placing the paper upon the table, was slid under my door on the second night. Holmes unfolded it with care. I leaned in and saw that it was not a letter in the usual sense, but a page torn from a ledger, covered with columns of figures. Across the top, however, someone had written in a hurried hand, "Leave before the 7th night." Holmes's fingers paused upon the words. "And the cloth?" Eleanor unwrapped it. Within lay a little brass key, old-fashioned, with a blackened bow. "I found it," she said, "on my pillow." Holmes held the key up to the light, turning it between finger and thumb. "Have you found what it opens?" "No," she answered. "I have tried every lock in the house that I know of. It fits none." Holmes' gaze shifted to her. "And yet you kept it." "I did not dare throw it away," she said, and there was a simple honesty in the confession. It felt like a message, like a hand placed upon my throat. Holmes set the key down gently. "Continue." "The third night," Eleanor said, "I woke to the sound of someone walking in the passage outside my room. The boards creaked. I called out, and the steps stopped. Then—" she swallowed. "Then the handle of my door began to turn very slowly, as if someone wished me to hear it." "And was your door locked?" asked Holmes. "Yes." "Did the handle turn fully?" "No, it stopped. And then I heard something else, a soft scraping like metal against metal." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "A key?" "I thought so," she said. "But no key entered. There was only the sound, and then it went away." "And you did not pursue?" I asked, unable to keep the reproach from my voice. Eleanor's gaze snapped to mine. "Dr. Watson," she said, very quietly, "if you had been alone in this house, and you had heard a stranger test your door in the night, would you have opened it to chase him down dark?" "Stairs," I coloured. "No," I admitted. Holmes interposed smoothly. "You did right. Go on." "The next day I spoke to Mrs. Hudson." She corrected herself with a faint start. "I mean to Mrs. Penrose, the housekeeper assigned by the estate. She said she heard nothing. The servants all say they hear nothing. And yet—" Eleanor's hands spread in a gesture of helplessness. "And yet I know there is someone here." Holmes's head inclined. "Because of the footsteps." "And because of this," said Eleanor, and with a suddenness that made me start, she rose and crossed to the far wall. There hung a framed charcoal sketch, a view of Brackenbury Square in summer, the trees in leaf, children at play. She lifted it from its hook, and behind it, where the wallpaper should have been continuous, there was a narrow slit, scarcely visible, like the seam of a concealed panel. Holmes was at her side in an instant. He ran his fingers along the slit, his touch as delicate as a surgeon's. "A hidden door," he murmured. "I found it yesterday," Eleanor said, "by accident. The picture fell when I brushed past. Behind it, I saw the seam. I tried to press it, to pull it, but it would not move."
And then, her voice dropped, "last night, it was open." Holmes's hand stilled. "Open?" Eleanor nodded. "Only a little. The seam was wider. There was darkness behind it and a smell, earth and old stone. I did not go in. I did not dare. I pushed it shut and hung the picture again. And then I wrote to you." Holmes stepped back and regarded the wall with the expression of a man presented with a chessboard at mid-game. "You have done very wisely," said he, and I saw that for once it was not mere politeness. It was genuine approval. "Now, Miss Carroway, because I presume you are not Mrs. Watson." "Carroway, I am not," she said sharply. Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Excellent. Then we are spared one set of assumptions. Tell me, who else knows you are in this house?" "Mr. Lionel," she replied. "Mrs. Penrose, the servants."
"And perhaps," she hesitated, "perhaps others who have watched the estate business." "You have a suitor?" Holmes asked abruptly. Eleanor's head came up, colour rising in her cheeks again, but this time with anger rather than fear. "No," she said, And I resent the implication. Holmes waved his hand as if brushing away smoke. Not a suitor, then? A rival? An enemy? Someone who would benefit from frightening you away?
I do not know, she said, and her voice wavered for the first time with uncertainty. But I know one thing, Mr. Holmes. If I leave, Mr. Lionel will say I have failed him.
He will ruin me. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You fear Mr. Lionel as much as you fear this house. Eleanor did not answer directly. She moved to the window and peered through the curtain as if to reassure herself that the world outside still existed. I fear, she said at last, that Mr. Lionel is reckless, and that recklessness is dangerous. He thinks this is all gossip and nerves. He would laugh at me. And yet last night, after I shut the hidden door, I found a fresh footprint in the dust of my sitting-room hearth. Holmes's head turned sharply. A footprint in the room? Yes. It was not mine. Holmes sprang up. Show me. She led us to the fireplace. The grate was cold, though a fire had been laid ready. Upon the hearthstone, in a thin layer of grey dust, there was indeed the clear imprint of a boot. Holmes dropped to one knee, his nose near the stone like a hound. I watched, fascinated, as his fingers traced the outline without touching it. For all my familiarity with him, there remained something uncanny in the way he could read a tale in such mute marks. A man, he murmured, heavy, not a servant. The heel is worn unevenly, a limp, perhaps, or a habit of turning on one foot. He looked up and his gaze met mine. And now, said he, we have passed from melodrama to method. He rose and turned to Eleanor. Lock every door and window behind us.
Tell no one in this house that we are here, not even Mrs. Penrose. If anyone asks, you have had a headache and received only your doctor. Eleanor glanced at me as if in doubt.
I am a doctor, I said. Holmes's smile flickered. And to the servants, Watson, that will be explanation enough. Now, he returned to the wall with the concealed panel. His long fingers found the seam, pressed, then tapped lightly, listening. He moved along it inch by inch, like a man playing a strange instrument. At one point, he stopped, his eyes fixed upon a place near the skirting board. There, he said softly. He knelt, and with the blade of his pocket-knife, lifted a tiny sliver of something from the seam, a minute curl of pale wood. A wedge, he murmured. Recently inserted. Miss Carroway, when you pushed the door shut last night, did it close easily? No, she said. It resisted as if something caught. Holmes nodded once. Because someone wished it to resist. Someone wished you to notice it open. To frighten me, she whispered. Or to draw you, said Holmes. He straightened and, without further ceremony, drew the picture aside and set his shoulder against the wall. There was a faint click. The panel, so perfectly fitted that one might have lived here a lifetime without noticing it, swung inward a few inches. A breath of air came out, cold and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of earth and stagnant stone. Holmes paused, his eyes glittering in the lamplight. For one instant he stood poised upon the threshold of that darkness, and I saw in his profile the expression of the hunter who has found the lair. Then he turned his head slightly toward me. Watson, said he, you will record what you see, but you will not, if you value our client's nerves, interpret it aloud. And you? I asked. Holmes's mouth curved. I shall interpret it silently. Come. He took a small lantern from a side table. Eleanor, it seemed, had anticipated the need, and with a deft movement lit it. Its glow cast a trembling circle upon the blackness beyond the panel. We stepped forward. The passage behind the wall was narrow, lined with old brick, and sloped gently downward. The air grew colder as we descended, and the house above seemed to recede into a distant world of carpets and curtains. Our footsteps sounded strangely loud, as if the stones drank sound, and then returned it altered. After perhaps 20 paces, the passage widened into a small chamber. The lantern light revealed rough-hewn walls and a floor of packed earth. At the far side was another door, this one of heavy wood bound with iron, and in its center a keyhole that might well have been made for the brass key Eleanor had found upon her
Pillow. Holmes held the lantern up, examining the keyhole. He did not yet insert the key.
Instead, he turned his head, and for the first time since we entered the passage, his face showed something like surprise. Upon the earth near the door, scattered as if dropped in haste, lay several white fragments. Holmes bent and picked one up. It was bone. He rolled it between finger and thumb, his nostrils flaring slightly. "A chicken bone," I suggested, striving for a rational tone. Holmes's eyes remained on the fragment. "No," said he very softly, "not chicken." Eleanor behind us gave a small sound, half gasp, half stifled cry. Holmes's hand rose, palm outward, commanding silence. He listened. At first I heard nothing. Then faintly from beyond the iron-bound door there came a sound, a low, rhythmic scrape, as of something being dragged slowly across stone. Holmes' gaze met mine in the lantern light. "Now," said he with an odd quietness, "we learn why the house refuses new owners." And with that he fitted the brass key into the lock and turned it. The key turned with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space, a reluctant, grinding click, as though the lock itself protested the intrusion. Holmes paused with the key still held between finger and thumb, his body angled toward the door, every line of him attentive. The scraping beyond ceased at once. For a heartbeat there was only silence, thick and oppressive, pressing upon the ears. I was acutely conscious of Eleanor Carroway behind us, her breath coming shallow and fast, and of the lantern's small flame quivering in Holmes's hand. "Do not move," Holmes whispered. He lowered the lantern slightly, shielding it with his palm, and bent until his ear was close to the iron-bound door. I followed his example, though with far less confidence. At first I heard nothing but the blood in my own head. Then, so faint I might have doubted it had Holmes not stiffened beside me, I caught a sound from within, a slow, careful inhalation, as of someone restraining their breath. Holmes straightened, and in the half-light I saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips, not of amusement, but of confirmation. "We are not alone," he murmured, which is, under the circumstances, a relief. Before I could ask him to explain this paradox, he rapped sharply upon the door with the handle of his knife. 2 quick blows, authoritative, confident. "Come out," he called, his voice carrying with surprising clarity through the wood. "You are discovered. Any further concealment will only worsen your position." There was a pause, longer this time. I felt Eleanor's fingers clutch the back of my coat. Then came a shuffling sound, the scrape we had heard before, closer now, followed by the dull thud of something heavy being shifted. At last a voice answered, hoarse, uncertain, but unmistakably human. "Who are you?" "A friend to daylight," said Holmes calmly, "and a very dangerous enemy to those who abuse darkness. Open the door." A short, humorless laugh came from within. "You'll find no ghosts here, sir, if that's what you're after." Holmes's eyes flicked to the bone fragments at his feet. "I find very few ghosts anywhere," he replied, "but I have a keen interest in men who wish to be mistaken for them." There was a muttered curse, and then the door creaked inward a few inches. Holmes stepped back at once, drawing me with him, placing himself slightly in front of Eleanor without apparent effort. The lantern light fell upon a narrow opening, revealing a portion of the chamber beyond. It was larger than ours and better finished, with stone walls dressed smooth and a ceiling supported by thick beams. A rough table stood to one side, cluttered with tools, chisels, a mallet, coils of rope. In the center, hunched near the door, was a man. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, his clothes stained with earth and lime. One leg was stiffly extended, the foot turned outward at an unnatural angle, accounting neatly for the uneven heel print Holmes had observed above. His face, when he lifted it fully into the light, was lined and weathered, with eyes that darted from Holmes to me and back again, calculating and afraid. "Step out," Holmes said. The man hesitated, then pushed the door wider and limped forward, favouring his good leg. As he emerged, the full extent of the chamber behind him became visible, and with it, the source of that cold, earthen smell. Against the far wall lay a shallow pit, newly dug, its edges raw. Beside it were more bones, some bleached, some dark with age. Eleanor uttered a faint cry and would have rushed forward had I not caught her arm. Holmes's gaze never left the man. "Your name," he said. The fellow swallowed. "Thomas Rigg," he answered, "if you please." "Formerly employed by Sir Hugh Densmore," Holmes went on. Rigg's eyes widened a fraction. "Aye, long time ago. As a groom," Holmes continued, "until an accident left you with that leg and without your position." Rigg's mouth tightened. "That's my business." "It became my business," Holmes replied coolly, "when you decided to continue residing on Densmore property without permission, frightening off tenants and, if my inference is correct, disposing of certain inconvenient remains." Rigg's gaze flicked toward the pit, despite himself. "Those bones," Holmes said, following the glance, "belong to small animals for the most part. Dogs, perhaps, cats, creatures easily obtained whose absence excites little notice. Their purpose is theatrical rather than practical." "You don't know that," Rigg muttered. "I know it because you wish to be feared, not caught," Holmes said. "A murderer hides bodies, a deceiver displays them." Rigg's shoulders sagged a little as though some of the fight had gone out of him. "They weren't meant to see," he said, jerking his head toward Eleanor. "And yet you placed the key upon her pillow," Holmes observed. "You slid the warning under her door. You wedged the panel so she would notice it. You wanted her to see." Rigg laughed bitterly. "I wanted her gone, that's all." "Why?" Eleanor demanded, finding her voice at last. "What claim have you on this house?" Rigg looked at her then, really looked, and something like resentment flared in his eyes. "Because it was promised," he said. "Because Sir Hugh said." Holmes raised a hand. "Careful, Mr. Rigg. Promises made in private are the most difficult to prove." Rigg's jaw worked. "He said I could stay," he burst out. "That I'd have rooms here below out of the way. I knew the passages his brother showed me years ago. They used them for storage for wine. Sir Hugh said I could keep them so long as I kept quiet." "And you did," said Holmes, "until the house was sold." "They were going to wall it up," Rigg said hoarsely. "Seal it all. I'd be turned out into the street after all those years." "So you frightened them," Holmes said. "Mr. Partridge first. A few noises, a glimpse of movement, a bone or two placed where it would be found. When that succeeded, you refined the performance." Rigg said nothing. "Mrs. Mize, Evesham," Holmes went on, inexorable, "was already nervous. A few whispers through the walls, quite easy, given the old ventilation shafts, and the sight of a figure where none should be, were sufficient." "And the clergyman?" I asked quietly. Rigg's face darkened. "He came down here," he said. "Found me, thought I was the devil, I suppose, or something near enough. He shouted. I panicked. He fell, hit his head." He gestured toward the pit. "I buried him." Eleanor swayed, and I steadied her. Holmes' expression was grim, but there was no triumph in it. "An accident," he said, followed by a very deliberate campaign of deception. Rigg sank down on the edge of the pit, his head in his hands. "I never meant—" "You meant enough," Holmes said. "And now you have gone further. You escalated because Miss Carroway did not flee as the others had. You introduced the threat of violence to force her hand." Rigg looked up sharply. "I wouldn't have hurt her." Holmes's eyes were cold. "You already have. Fear is an injury, Mr. Rigg, and not a trivial one." He turned slightly toward me. "Watson, you will escort Miss Carroway back to the sitting room. She has seen enough for one morning." "And you?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling but resolute. Holmes met her gaze. I shall remain with Mr. Rigg until the police arrive. He is unlikely to attempt flight with that leg, and even if he did, his hand brushed his coat pocket. I am prepared. As we withdrew, I glanced back once. Holmes stood in the lantern light, tall and composed, the miserable figure of Thomas Rigg slumped at his feet, the hidden world beneath the respectable house laid bare at last. The scraping sound we had heard before did not come again. It had been replaced by something far more ordinary and far more damning, the quiet, broken breathing of a man whose secrets had finally reached the surface. We ascended to the sitting room in silence, the house seeming to close around us once more like a well-trained accomplice. Eleanor Carroway sank into a chair, her composure at last spent, though she did not weep. She sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, as if determined that fear should not claim a second victory over her. I poured her a glass of water, which she accepted with a murmured thanks. "You did not tell me," she said after a moment, staring into the glass, "that there might be a body."
"I did not know," I replied truthfully. "Had I suspected, I should not have allowed you below." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "And yet I am glad I went."
There are fears worse than facts. Before I could respond, there came the sound of footsteps above, measured, deliberate. Holmes appeared in the doorway, closing it softly behind him. "Mr. Rigg is secured," he said. "I have sent word to Lestrade by means of your kitchen boy, Miss Carroway. He should arrive within the hour." She looked up sharply. "You sent for the police?" "Of course," Holmes replied. "You did not suppose I meant to keep him as a curiosity?" Her lips pressed together. "Mr. Lionel will not be pleased." Holmes's gaze sharpened at once. "No," he said, "and that fact, I think, is worthy of examination." She frowned.
"You believe he knew?"
"I believe," Holmes said, settling into a chair at last, "that your employer has been remarkably incurious about the persistent failure of this property to remain sold." "That is not a crime," she said quickly. "No," Holmes agreed, "but incuriosity can be a form of strategy." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Miss Carroway, when Mr. Lionel instructed you to live here, did he warn you of Mr. Rigg?" She shook her head. "He said nothing of former servants."
"Only that the stories were nonsense, and that a sensible woman would not be frightened by shadows." "Did he know of the hidden passages?" Holmes asked. "I do not know," she said. "Sir Hugh mentioned them once, years ago, but only in passing. I never heard Mr. Lionel speak of them."
Holmes nodded, though I could see his mind working rapidly behind the placid exterior. "Watson," he said, "you observed Mr. Rigg's chamber. Did you notice the tools?" "Yes," I replied. "Chisels, rope, a mallet." "Quite," said Holmes. "And yet none of those were required merely to frighten tenants. They were required to modify the house." Eleanor's brow creased. "Modify it how?" "By enlarging passages," Holmes said, "by accessing spaces that had been sealed or forgotten. Mr. Rigg was not merely hiding, he was improving his position." "To what end?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "To survive. Men drive an underground rarely content themselves with stasis. They expand." There was a knock at the front door, sharp and authoritative. Eleanor started. "That will be Lestrade," Holmes said, rising. "If you please, Miss Carroway, remain here." Inspector Lestrade entered with his usual air of bustling efficiency, his eyes already alive with the promise of something unusual. "Well, Holmes," he said, rubbing his hands, "you found yourself another cellar-dweller, I hear." "You might say that," Holmes replied, "but I advise you not to close the book too quickly." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Mr. Rigg will confess readily enough," Holmes continued. "He has already told me more than he intended. You will find the remains of Reverend Marr below, along with sufficient evidence to secure a conviction." Lestrade nodded. "Then what's the difficulty?" "The difficulty," Holmes said, "is motive, or rather complete motive. Lestrade snorted. He wanted the house. Simple enough. Was it? Holmes countered. A single man, lame, without legal claim, attempting to hold an entire property indefinitely by frightening off buyers? That is not a plan, it is a delay. Lestrade's expression sobered. You think someone was backing him? I think, Holmes said, that someone benefited greatly from those delays. Lestrade folded his arms. You're thinking of the heir? I am thinking of the estate, Holmes replied, and of a man drowning in debt. Eleanor rose from her chair. Mr. Lionel would never—
Holmes turned to her gently. I do not yet accuse him. I merely note that Mr.
Rigg's continued occupation conveniently prevented the sale of a house whose true value may not lie in its drawing rooms. Lestrade frowned. What else would it lie in? Holmes's eyes flicked briefly toward the floor. In what lies beneath? There was a moment of silence. You mean the passages? Lestrade said slowly. And whatever they connect to, Holmes replied. Wine cellars, old boundaries, perhaps access to neighbouring properties. Brackenbury Square is older than it looks, Inspector. Houses shift, lines blur. Fortunes are made in such margins. Lestrade exhaled. You're suggesting that Mr. Rigg may not have been acting entirely alone, Holmes said. Or at the very least, that his presence was known and tolerated by someone who found it useful. Eleanor sank back into her chair, colour draining from her face. You mean Mr.
Lionel knew a man was living beneath this house, and sent me here anyway?
I mean, Holmes said carefully, that he may have suspected something and chosen not to look too closely. Recklessness, as you called it, can be a form of cruelty. Lestrade cleared his throat. I'll have a word with the heir, he said, discreetly. Holmes inclined his head. That would be wise. As Lestrade departed to attend to his prisoner, Holmes returned to the window and drew the curtain aside an inch. The fog had thinned. Daylight was asserting itself. For now, he said quietly. You are safe, Miss Carroway. Mr. Rigg will trouble no one again. She looked at him, searching his face. For now, she repeated. But this is not finished, is it? Holmes's reflection in the glass showed a thoughtful smile. No, said he, it is merely begun. A house that refuses new owners does so because someone wishes to keep what lies within, and we have not yet asked the most important question. And that is, I asked. Holmes let the curtain fall back into place. Who, he said softly, stands to inherit what the house has been hiding all along? Lestrade did not return at once. The house, relieved of its subterranean secret, yet still heavy with the knowledge of it, settled into an uneasy quiet. Eleanor Carroway sat by the window now, watching the square as though the ordinary business of passers-by might anchor her again to the familiar world. Holmes, for his part, had resumed that attitude of apparent indolence which so often concealed his most active reasoning, his long frame stretched upon the sofa, his fingers loosely interlaced upon his chest. I knew better than to disturb him. Experience had taught me that questions, at such moments, were not merely unhelpful, but actively resented. Instead, I took out my notebook and made a few brief memoranda, while the impressions of the underground chamber were still sharp in my mind. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. Mr. Holmes, she said, without turning from the window, if this house conceals something of value, something worth frightening people away for, then I have been living above it for nearly a week. Was I ever in real danger? Holmes opened his eyes, but did not at once rise. Yes, he said simply. And no. She turned then, facing him fully. You cannot mean both? I can and do, Holmes replied. You were never in danger of a random or impulsive act, Mr. Rigg is not a man of violence by nature. His crime was born of desperation, not cruelty. But you were in danger of persistence. Persistence? When fear fails, Holmes said, men who rely upon it often escalate. Each success teaches them the necessity of greater exertion. Had you remained, and had you continued to resist his efforts to dislodge you, he would have been forced to consider stronger measures, not because he wished to harm you, but because he wished to preserve his position. Eleanor absorbed this in silence. "And Mr. Lionel?" she asked at last. "Does he fall under the same rule?" Holmes regarded her steadily. "Mr. Lionel," he said, "is a different species of danger altogether. One must not confuse the brute force of a cornered man with the cold arithmetic of a desperate one." She closed her eyes briefly. "Then you do believe he knew?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that he suspected, and that suspicion, when combined with debt, has a remarkable power to dull the moral sense." At that moment the door opened and Lestrade returned. His expression altered from its earlier confidence to something more guarded.
"Well," he said, removing his hat, "you were right to warn me, Holmes." "About Mr. Lionel?" Holmes asked. Lestrade nodded. He didn't deny knowing of Rigg.
Claimed it was an old nuisance left over from his uncle's time. Said he assumed the fellow had moved on years ago. And yet, Holmes said mildly, he never made any serious effort to investigate the repeated failures of sale. Lestrade grimaced. "When I pressed him, he admitted he'd heard rumours of the passages, said he thought them sealed." "Did he?" Holmes murmured. "There's more," Lestrade went on. "We had a look at the old estate papers, deeds, surveys, that sort of thing. Turns out the boundary lines under Brackenbury Square are irregular." Holmes sat up at once.
"Irregular in what manner?" "One of the neighbouring houses," Lestrade said, "extends its cellar farther than it ought to."
"According to the plans, it cuts right through what should be Densmore property." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And that neighbouring house belongs to—" "A firm of wine merchants," Lestrade answered. "They've been expanding quietly for years, buying up old stock, old tunnels, old rights of way." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then the picture sharpens. Mr. Lionel inherits a house riddled with forgotten passages and disputed underground rights. He is in debt. He wishes to sell, but only at the right moment, after certain arrangements have been made, certain profits secured." "And Rigg?" Lestrade asked. "A convenient sentinel," Holmes replied. "A man already living below, already invested in secrecy, easily manipulated by hints and half-promises. Whether Mr. Lionel explicitly instructed him or merely allowed him to continue is perhaps a matter the courts will decide." Eleanor had gone very pale. "You mean," she said slowly, "that I was sent here not to disprove the rumours, but to contain them, to keep the house nominally occupied," Holmes said, "while its true value was extracted beneath your feet." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "That's a bit above Rigg's pay grade." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, "which is why Rigg's activities grew more desperate. His usefulness was nearing its end. Once the underground matters were settled, he would have been discarded." Eleanor rose abruptly. "Then I must leave this place at once." Holmes stood as well. "Yes," he said.
"You must, and you will." "But my position—" "Will be resolved," Holmes interrupted. "I have already drafted a letter to Mr.
Lionel, outlining what I know and what the police are now certain to discover. He will find it expedient to terminate your employment with a generous settlement rather than invite further scrutiny." She stared at him. "You did all this without telling me?"
Holmes inclined his head. "I did not wish to alarm you further. Fear is most useful to those who trade in it." Lestrade replaced his hat.
"I'll see to it the house is sealed properly this time," he said. "No more underground tenants." "And the merchants?" I asked. Lestrade shrugged. "We'll look into their cellars. Funny how often honest trade runs into dishonest stonework." When he had gone, Eleanor stood for a moment as if uncertain how to conduct herself in a world that had shifted so abruptly. "I do not know how to thank you," she said at last. Holmes picked up his violin case. "By living unafraid," he replied, and by remembering that mystery is rarely supernatural. It is merely human complexity viewed from an inconvenient angle. As we stepped out into the square, the fog had lifted almost entirely. The house behind us stood as it always had, solid, respectable, inscrutable. Yet I could not help feeling that, like many such facades, it concealed a history written not in bricks and mortar, but in fear, greed, and the quiet endurance of those who lived in its shadow. We had gone no more than half the length of Brackenbury Square when Holmes slackened his pace and touched my sleeve. "Do not look back," he murmured, "but observe our reflections in the shop window to the left." I complied, and in the glass I perceived the distorted shapes of ourselves, and behind them, at a discreet distance, a man who had not been there moments before. He walked with the air of one who wished neither to hurry nor to linger, his gaze fixed with studied casualness upon the pavement ahead. "An admirer?" I ventured under my breath. "An accountant," Holmes replied, "or something very like one. Note the careful dress, the lack of curiosity, the excessive discretion. He is watching us leave the house, not to see where we go, but to confirm that we have gone." "From whom?" Holmes's mouth curved slightly. "That is the more interesting question." We continued on, turning deliberately into a quieter street and then another, until Holmes halted abruptly before a bookseller's shop and wheeled round. The man behind us stopped also, pretending to examine a display of second-hand atlases. Holmes approached him at once. "You may tell Mr. Lionel Densmore," Holmes said pleasantly, "that I shall call upon him this afternoon." The fellow started, colour rising to his cheeks. "I don't know any—" "Pray spare yourself the effort," Holmes interrupted. "You have followed us with commendable restraint but poor imagination. No idle stroller watches a house so intently, nor abandons his walk the instant its occupants depart." The man muttered something indistinct and retreated hastily down the street. Holmes turned back to me, his eyes bright. "Our air is anxious," he said. "An excellent sign." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes lost no time in committing to paper a letter of such concise menace, couched, of course, in the politest terms, that I could not help pitying its recipient. It was dispatched by hand within the hour. That afternoon we were admitted to Mr. Lionel Densmore's chambers off Pall Mall. He was a tall, fair man, impeccably dressed, with the easy confidence of one accustomed to command respect by virtue of name rather than merit. He received Holmes with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, offering a hand that Holmes declined to take. "I am surprised. I thought the matter of Brackenbury Square had been settled." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, seating himself without invitation, "it has merely been illuminated." Densmore's smile stiffened. "I do not know what you mean." Holmes produced a folded paper. "You know Mr. Thomas Rigg?" Densmore's hand tightened upon the back of his chair. "A former servant, a crippled nuisance." "A nuisance you permitted to remain beneath your property," Holmes said, "and to perform services of intimidation on your behalf."
"That is absurd," Densmore snapped. "I knew nothing of his presence."
"Then you will have no objection," Holmes returned, "to explaining the correspondence between yourself and Messrs. Halverson and Pike, wine merchants, regarding the temporary obstruction of subterranean access." Densmore's composure cracked then, just perceptibly. "Private business." "Criminal business," Holmes corrected. "The passages beneath Brackenbury Square provided access to cellars extending beyond your legal boundary. You stood to profit handsomely by delaying sale until those arrangements were concluded. Mr. Rigg's occupation ensured that delay." Densmore laughed sharply. "You have no proof." Holmes leaned forward. "I have Mr. Rigg's testimony. I have the bones of Reverend Marr. I have altered deeds, irregular surveys, and a witness you sent into danger to serve as your alibi." Densmore's gaze flicked involuntarily toward the door. "Do not trouble yourself," Holmes said. "Inspector Lestrade is already on his way." For a moment I thought Densmore might attempt flight or violence. Instead, he sank back into his chair, his confidence draining away like water from a cracked vessel. "You do not understand," he said hoarsely. "I inherited nothing but debt. The estate was bleeding me dry. I did what I had to do." "You did what was easiest," Holmes replied. "There is a difference." The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. As we left the building, Holmes seemed uncharacteristically pensive. "You look dissatisfied," I observed. "Justice," he said slowly, "is rarely symmetrical. Mr. Rigg will hang or rot in prison. Mr. Densmore will suffer disgrace, but others, those who benefited indirectly, will remain untouched." "That cannot be helped," I said. Holmes glanced at me. "It can be helped, but not always by the law." That evening, as we sat before the fire in Baker Street, Holmes took up his violin and played. Not one of his more brilliant displays, but a subdued, reflective air that matched his mood. "Watson," he said at last, lowering the instrument, "you will recall that Miss Carroway feared ruin." "Yes." "She will not be ruined," Holmes said. "I have arranged matters. A position awaits her with friends of mine, people who value discretion but do not exploit it." "You play Providence as well as detective," I remarked. Holmes shrugged. "I merely redress an imbalance where I can." Outside, London resumed its endless motion, ignorant of the quiet tragedies and calculations that shaped its respectable facades. As for the house in Brackenbury Square, it would soon accept new owners at last, not because it had been exorcised, but because its secrets had been dragged into the light. And I reflected, as I often did, that the most stubborn hauntings are those created by men, and that it takes a singular mind indeed to lay them finally to rest. The case might have ended there, as so many do in the public imagination, with an arrest, a scandal, and a property restored to the market. But Holmes was not a man to mistake resolution for completeness. For several days after Lionel Densmore's arrest, he remained unusually restless, pacing the length of Baker Street, his pipe forgotten and his violin untouched. I recognized the signs. There was some loose end which offended his sense of order. It was on the third evening that he gave voice to it. "Watson," he said, stopping abruptly before the mantel, "tell me, what is the one element in this affair which does not quite satisfy you?" I considered. Mr. Rigg's actions were desperate but consistent. Mr. Densmore's motives were sordid but intelligible. Miss Carroway was used but is now safe. I confess I should be content. Holmes shook his head. "Then you have allowed the obvious to distract you from the significant." "And that is?" "The timing," he replied. "Everything occurred too late." I raised an eyebrow. "Too late for what?" "For the original crime," Holmes said quietly. "Reverend Marr did not die because of the wine merchants, nor because of Mr. Densmore's debts. He died because he discovered something neither man anticipated." He crossed to his desk and took up a folded sheet of paper. "Lestrade sent this to me this morning. It was found among Marr's effects, concealed within a Bible." He handed it to me. It was a rough sketch, an outline of underground passages, marked with measurements and annotations in a hurried hand. One section was circled repeatedly. "A survey?" I suggested. "A correction," Holmes replied. "Marr was no fool. He had a taste for antiquarian studies. When he discovered Rigg below the house, he did not merely see a trespasser, he saw evidence that the estate maps were wrong. And that cost him his life." "Yes," Holmes said. "But what did he see that frightened Rigg into panic?" Before I could answer, there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a young clerk from a legal firm who bore a small, sealed parcel addressed to Holmes. It contained a brass-bound notebook, its pages filled with neat figures and references. Holmes's eyes lit at once. "From Halverson and Pike," he said. "Or rather, from a junior partner, now eager to distance himself." He leafed through the pages rapidly. "Just as I thought. Payments made not to Densmore directly, but to an intermediary, a trust established by Sir Hugh himself." "Sir Hugh?" I echoed. Sir Hugh Densmore, Holmes said, tapping the page, was not merely careless with his estate, he was speculative. He suspected years ago that the cellars beneath Brackenbury Square concealed access to something far older than wine vaults. To what? I asked. Holmes looked at me. To a Roman drainage line, I stared. You cannot be serious. On the contrary, Samdan, he said, London rests upon layers of forgotten engineering. Roman sewers, Saxon tunnels, medieval conduits. Sir Hugh believed one such line passed beneath his property, granting access well beyond his legal boundary. He invested quietly in its exploration. And Rigg? I asked. A useful assistant, Holmes replied, loyal, injured, and accustomed to silence. When Sir Hugh died, the work ceased, but Rigg remained, guarding what he barely understood. And Mr. Lionel sought to exploit it. Without grasping its full extent, Holmes said, he saw profit where his uncle had seen possibility. Ma, however, saw danger. Holmes rose and began pacing again. Imagine it, Watson, a clergyman alone at night discovering not merely a hidden tenant, but a breach in the city itself. He confronts Rigg, insists upon reporting it. Rigg panics. A shove, a fall, and then fear becomes policy. You think there is still something below? I asked. Holmes stopped. I am certain of it. The following morning we returned, briefly and discreetly, to Brackenbury Square, under the pretence of assisting the police with documentation. The house was empty now, stripped of its furniture, the servants dismissed. Its silence was different, no longer strained but hollow. Holmes led me once more through the concealed panel and down into the chamber. Rigg's pit had been filled in, the bones removed, but the iron-bound door beyond remained. This was never his destination, Holmes murmured. He knelt and examined the far wall, then smiled. Here. With some effort, he revealed a concealed stone, its edges worn smooth by repeated handling. Behind it lay a narrow shaft, descending sharply. I do not recommend you follow me, Holmes said, already lowering the lantern. I have followed you into worse, I replied, and followed. The shaft led to a low tunnel, ancient beyond doubt, its brickwork rounded with age. The air was dry, stale, untouched by recent habitation. At some point, Holmes said, this connected to the Roman system, but here, he halted, raising the lantern. The tunnel ended abruptly in a collapse. But embedded in the fallen stone was a small metal box, its surface corroded but intact. Holmes extracted it carefully and opened it. Inside lay parchment fragments, brittle with age, bearing Latin inscriptions and a crude map of the surrounding area. Sir Hugh was right, Holmes said softly, but he was too late. What are they? I asked. Records, Holmes replied. Property claims, evidence that parts of modern London rest upon misappropriated Roman works, enough to entangle half a dozen estates in litigation for decades. And now, I asked, Holmes closed the box. Now they will go where they belong. To the authorities? He smiled thinly. To scholars, quiet ones, the dead have caused enough trouble for the living in this affair. As we emerged into the daylight once more, Holmes paused and looked back at the house. It refused new owners, he said, because it was never meant to be owned in the modern sense. It was a junction of greed, of history, of fear. And you? I asked. Holmes turned away. I merely redirected the traffic. That evening, as London's lamps flickered into life, Holmes seemed at last at ease. The city, layered and secretive, had yielded one more of its buried truths, not with a scream, but with a whisper, which only those who listen very closely are ever meant to hear. Holmes did not speak of the box again that night, nor for several days thereafter. He had delivered it, as promised, into the discreet hands of a small circle of antiquarians whose loyalty lay more with history than with publicity, and with that act he seemed to consider the matter concluded. Yet I observed that his restlessness had not entirely abated. The violin returned to its case less often than usual, and more than once I found him standing at the window long after midnight, gazing out upon the gaslit street with a baying expression of thoughtful unease. It was on one such evening that I ventured to remark upon it. "You have tied every thread," I said. "The crime is explained, the guilty are secured, the motive laid bare. What remains?" Holmes turned from the window. "A consequence," he replied, "which has not yet declared itself." Before I could press him further, Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a card. Holmes took it, glanced once, and allowed himself a faint smile. "Miss Carroway," he said. She was shown in at once. I was struck by the change in her appearance. The strain which had marked her face during our first meeting had eased, replaced by a quiet resolve. She greeted us with warmth and gratitude, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in her manner. "I did not come merely to thank you," she said, once seated, "though I shall do that as often as you will permit." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you have news?" "Yes," she replied. "Mr. Lionel's solicitors have been most accommodating. The settlement you predicted has been arranged, but that is not why I am here." She drew a folded paper from her reticule. "This was delivered to my lodgings this morning." There was no name. Holmes took it and read. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Watson," he said, handing it to me. It was a short note, written in a cramped, hurried hand. "You have uncovered more than you know. If you value discretion, leave the past where it lies. Others are watching." I looked up. "A threat?" "A reminder," Holmes replied. "And a clumsy one." Eleanor frowned. "From whom?" "From someone who fears," Holmes said, and fear is rarely anonymous.
He rose and paced. When Sir Hugh began his investigations, he did not act alone. He consulted, corresponded, hinted. Knowledge spreads even when guarded.
The Roman works beneath London are not a mere curiosity. They challenge ownership, profit, influence. "You believe someone else wants them suppressed," Eleanor said. Holmes nodded. "Not suppressed, controlled. Buried knowledge is power to those who know where to dig." As if summoned by the thought, there came a sharp knock at the door. This time, the visitor was Inspector Lestrade, his face grave. "I thought you'd want to hear this at once," he said without preamble. "There was an incident this afternoon at Brackenbury Square." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Go on." "One of the wine merchant's warehouses suffered a collapse," Lestrade continued. "Cellar floor gave way, no injuries, but the damage exposed part of an older tunnel system. The papers are already sniffing around." Holmes exhaled softly. "I feared as much." Lestrade hesitated. "There's more. Someone attempted to remove certain records from the city archives last night. Old surveys, Roman-era references. They were interrupted." "By whom?" Holmes asked. "By a clerk who recognized the irregularities and raised the alarm," Lestrade said. "The intruder escaped." Holmes exchanged a glance with me.
"You see, Watson? Consequence." Eleanor rose. "Then this is larger than any of us." "Yes," Holmes said, "and therefore more dangerous." Lestrade looked from one to the other.
"What do you propose?" Holmes's mouth curved in a thin smile. "We do nothing openly." Lestrade snorted. "Ha! That's not like you." "It is exactly like me," Holmes replied. "Those who trade in shadows expect pursuit. They do not expect neglect." After Lestrade departed, Holmes turned to Eleanor. "You must leave London for a time." "I expected as much," she said calmly. "I have arranged it," Holmes went on. "Your new position begins abroad. Distance is the best shield against curiosity." She met his gaze steadily. "And you?" Holmes's eyes flicked briefly toward the note on the table. "I shall remain. London does not give up its secrets easily, but it dislikes attention even more." She smiled faintly. "Then I suppose this is farewell." "For now," Holmes said. When she had gone, the house seemed quieter still. Holmes returned to the window. watching the street below. "They will test the boundaries," he said quietly. "Probe to see how much I know, how far I am willing to go." "And how far are you willing to go?" I asked. He did not answer at once. Instead, he took up his violin and drew the bow slowly across the strings, producing a low, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Far enough," he said at last, "to remind them that some foundations are best left undisturbed." Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels echoing faintly like distant thunder beneath the stones. I could not help but reflect that London, for all its surface order, was a city perpetually balanced upon what it had buried. And in that balance, Holmes moved with the sure-footedness of one who knew exactly where the ground was sound, and where it might yet give way. The days that followed passed with deceptive calm. London resumed its habitual rhythms, and the newspapers, having exhausted the novelty of Densmore's disgrace, turned their attention elsewhere. Yet beneath that surface I sensed a tightening, as though unseen hands were drawing cords ever closer. Holmes was quieter than I had known him in any recent case. He spoke little but listened much, and more than once I saw him destroy a letter after reading it, reducing it to ashes with a care that suggested calculation rather than irritation. When I questioned him, he brushed the matter aside. "Ripples, Watson," he said. "When one disturbs deep water, it takes time for them to reach the shore." One evening, as dusk settled and the lamps were being lit, Holmes broke his silence. "We are being tested," he remarked without preamble. "How?" I asked. "By omission," he replied. "No threats, no confrontations, no overt interference, merely a watching to see whether I shall act." "And will you?" He smiled faintly. "I already have." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, a Mr. Calder, introduced as a representative of a historical society with interests in Roman Britain. He spoke fluently, politely, and with a studied air of academic enthusiasm that failed to conceal the sharpness of his inquiries. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he said, "there are certain artifacts whose public revelation can cause complications." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "truth is notorious for that." Calder smiled thinly. "We are prepared to offer a generous sum for any materials you may have encountered beneath Brackenbury Square." "For their safekeeping." "For their disappearance," Holmes corrected. Calder's smile faded. "You are a difficult man." "I have made a study of difficulty," Holmes replied. The interview ended courteously but without agreement. When Calder had gone, Holmes turned to me. "He represents a consortium," he said. "Investors, landholders, scholars of convenience. They prefer history curated." "And you?" "I prefer it intact," Holmes said. That afternoon we received word that the antiquarians to whom Holmes had entrusted the Roman records had deposited them in a provincial archive, far from London's reach. The documents would be catalogued slowly, quietly, their implications unfolding over years rather than weeks. Holmes allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "That," he said, "should dull the appetite of our friends." Yet the final act of the affair came, as so often, from an unexpected quarter. Late one night, as I was preparing for bed, a cry rose from the street below. Holmes was at the window in an instant. "A disturbance," he said. "Come." We hurried down to find a small crowd gathered around a man who lay sprawled upon the pavement. He was alive but shaken, having been thrown from a carriage that had lurched violently before speeding away. When he saw Holmes, his eyes widened in recognition.
"You," he gasped. "They said you wouldn't." Holmes knelt beside him. "Who said?" The man swallowed. "Halverson," he whispered. "Pike."
They were going to destroy the tunnel, collapse it entirely. I tried to stop them. They said it was sanctioned. "By whom?" Holmes pressed. "By no one who would sign a name," the man said faintly. "But money was promised, silence bought." Holmes rose, his expression grim. "Watson, call for assistance." The man was taken away. And by morning Lestrade confirmed what Holmes had already deduced. An attempt had been made overnight to collapse portions of the old Roman line, an act halted only by the intervention of that unfortunate clerk. "They're trying to erase it," Lestrade said. "Bury the evidence permanently." "And in doing so," Holmes replied, "they have confirmed its value. By the week's end, warrants were issued, properties inspected, and the matter, too large now to be smothered, passed into the hands of committees and courts. The shadowy consortium retreated, its members exposed enough to retreat into safer obscurity." Holmes watched it all with detached interest. "You seem almost disappointed," I observed. "No," he said. "Relieved, the danger lay not in what was hidden, but in who controlled the hiding." On the evening Eleanor Carroway departed London, she wrote one last note to Holmes, expressing gratitude and a quiet hope for the future. Holmes read it once and placed it carefully in his drawer. "She will do well," he said. "She has learned the cost of looking too closely, and the necessity of doing so anyway." As for the house in Brackenbury Square, it stood empty for some months, its cellars sealed under official supervision. When it was at last sold, it passed into cautious hands, its price diminished by the weight of its history. And Holmes, he returned at last to his violin, filling Baker Street with a melody at once contemplative and resolved. I listened and understood that the case had reached its true end, not with an arrest or a revelation, but with the restoration of balance. London slept above its buried past, uneasy but intact. And Holmes, guardian of its more inconvenient truths, kept his watch, not as a conqueror of darkness, but as one who knew precisely how much light was enough. Time passed as it must, and with it came the peculiar aftermath that follows every affair in which Holmes has engaged not merely with crime, but with consequence. London had absorbed the disturbance, folded it into its vast and patient memory, and moved on. Yet I perceived that the city's apparent indifference troubled Holmes more than overt hostility ever could. He was seated at his desk one morning, examining a map of London spread wide before him, its surface crowded with annotations in his fine, precise hand. Lines traced forgotten courses beneath streets we walked daily. Small symbols marked points of former interest, cellars, drains, sealed arches. We walked eastward, away from the familiar routes of our habits, until the streets grew narrower and the architecture older, bearing the faint but unmistakable stamp of, "When a mystery appears supernatural, search first for profit. When it appears profitable, search next for fear." Outside, London breathed and shifted, layered and enduring. Somewhere beneath its streets lay the remnants of empires, their power long since reduced to stone and dust.